Bleeding Kansas was not a rehearsal for the Civil War, so much as one of its first battlefields, opened by an act of Congress before Kansas was even a state. That is the uncomfortable part of the story. The violence did not begin with two armies facing each other under flags. It began with a law that promised local choice. It began with the idea that settlers themselves could decide whether slavery would live or die in a territory. On paper, that sounded like a democratic solution to a national crisis. In practice, it meant that the question of slavery was carried into town sites, election places, river crossings, printing offices, hotels, and farms. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was enacted on May 30th, 1854. Its immediate purpose was territorial organization. It created Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory, opening a vast region to settlement and future statehood. But its deeper effect was to disturb a political arrangement that many Americans had treated as settled for more than a generation. That arrangement was the Missouri Compromise restriction. Under that restriction, slavery had been barred north of 36 degrees 30 minutes, except in Missouri. The Kansas-Nebraska Act made that restriction inoperative for the new territories. It did not simply draw new lines on a map. It removed an older line that had carried enormous political meaning. In its place, the act substituted popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that the people of a territory would decide the status of slavery for themselves. For Kansas, that meant residents would vote and organize through territorial politics to determine whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free state or a slave state. Congress would not exclude slavery in advance. The decision would be pushed downward, into the territory, into the hands of settlers. The theory depended on a calm assumption that the people who moved into Kansas would form a political community, hold elections, and settle the question through ordinary institutions. But Kansas was not an isolated laboratory. It lay directly beside Missouri, a slave state. The border was not a distant abstraction. It was a route. It could be crossed by settlers, voters, organizers, armed men, and later, raiders. That geography would turn a doctrine into a crisis. The law had opened more than land. It opened a contest. Kansas became a test case because its future status mattered beyond its own borders. If settlers could make Kansas a slave state, then the removal of the Missouri Compromise restriction had real force. If free state settlers could make Kansas a free state, then organized migration and territorial politics could resist the spread of slavery, even without congressional prohibition. Either way, Kansas would not merely be settled. It would be fought over politically from the beginning. The phrase popular sovereignty sounded neutral, almost procedural. It suggested ballots, meetings, local debate, and majority rule. But the stakes were too high for neutrality. Pro-slavery settlers, free staters, and abolitionists would all see Kansas as a place where physical presence could become political power. To live there, to claim land there, to build a town there, to publish a newspaper there, to vote there, each act could be part of deciding the fate of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act therefore changed the meaning of migration. Moving west was not only a private choice about land or opportunity. In Kansas, settlement itself became political. A cabin could be counted as commitment. A town could become a declaration. A road or river landing could shape who arrived, who voted, and who felt safe enough to stay. This is why the legal mechanism matters. The act did not command violence. It did not name the later places of violence, Lawrence, Pottawatomie Creek, Lynn County. It did not predict destroyed presses, retaliatory killings, or fraudulent elections. But it created the conditions in which the slavery question would be settled, or supposedly settled, by the balance of people on the ground. And once numbers mattered, movement mattered. Once elections mattered, intimidation mattered. Once Kansas became a proving ground, the border with Missouri became a strategic fact. Missouri's position was central from the start. The old Missouri Compromise had made Missouri the exception north of the 36 degrees, 30 minutes line. Now Kansas Territory lay beside it, and the question of slavery in Kansas could affect the political and social balance of the region. Western Missouri was not separated from eastern Kansas by a wall. It was close enough for men to cross, influence events, and return. What looked on a federal map like a boundary could function on the ground as a passage. That passage made the promise of local decision unstable. Who counted as local? Who had the right to shape Kansas? Was it the person who intended to settle permanently? The person who arrived for an election? The person who came to protect allies? The person who crossed the line to frighten opponents? Popular sovereignty did not answer these questions clearly enough to prevent conflict. It assumed a legitimate voting public before Kansas had a stable one. The act also reopened the national argument over slavery in territory that many believed had already been closed to it. That is why the crisis was so explosive. The struggle was not only over Kansas soil. It was over whether previous limits on slavery could be undone and whether democratic procedure could contain a moral and political conflict that had already divided the country. In the archive, the act can appear as legislation, enacted on May 30th, 1854, creating Kansas and Nebraska territories, making the Missouri Compromise restriction inoperative, substituting popular sovereignty for congressional exclusion. Those are clean phrases. They are accurate, but they do not capture the pressure placed on the people who would enter Kansas after the law took effect. A territory still had to be organized. Settlers had to arrive. Elections had to be held. Institutions had to claim authority. The future of slavery had to be translated from national debate into county meetings, polling places, land claims, and town foundations. The federal government had moved the decision closer to the ground, but the ground itself was contested, and Kansas was not empty of meaning before the first major clashes. From the moment the law created the territory, Kansas attracted people who understood that the outcome would matter nationally. Pro-slavery settlers came to support the legal future of slavery. Free staters came to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state. Abolitionists came with a more direct hostility to slavery itself. These categories were not always identical, but they all converged on the same fact. Kansas had become a place where political destiny could be changed by human movement. That convergence is the key to the early crisis. The Kansas-Nebraska Act did not merely ask, what should Congress permit? It asked, who can get to Kansas, organize, vote, and hold power? The answer would depend not only on ideals, but on roads, rivers, money, weapons, proximity, numbers, and fear. In time, the language of the conflict would harden. Missourians who crossed into Kansas to influence elections and intimidate Free State settlers would be called border ruffians. Free State raiders would later be associated with the term Jayhawkers. Lawrence would become a symbol. Presses would be destroyed. A hotel would be targeted as a headquarters of the Free State cause. Men would die near Pottawatomie Creek. The violence in Kansas would echo in the United States Senate. But all of that follows from the opening mechanism, a territorial law that replaced a congressional barrier with a local contest. The Kansas-Nebraska Act promised that the people of Kansas could decide. Yet, it did not guarantee that the people doing the deciding would agree on who belonged, who could vote, or what methods were legitimate. It placed a national crisis inside a borderland and trusted territorial politics to absorb it. That trust would not hold. The next movement of the story is not in Washington, but on the ground, among the settlers, organizers, and armed neighbors who entered Kansas, believing that the future of slavery could be won by being there first, voting there, staying there, or making sure their opponents could not. The law had opened the contest, but the contest itself had to be lived out in cabins, town meetings, river crossings, land claims, polling places, and armed gatherings. Popular sovereignty sounded orderly when described from a distance. In Kansas territory, it became a daily question of presence and power. Who counted as the people of Kansas? That was not an abstract dispute. It shaped who could claim land, who could organize a town, who could form a political association, who could appear at an election, and who could frighten an opponent away from doing the same. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had said, in effect, that the settlers would decide whether slavery would be permitted. But the act did not create a settled community ready to deliberate in peace. It created a prize and then invited rival movements to occupy it. Kansas drew people for many reasons. Some came for land. Some came for opportunity. Some came because the territory had become the place where the future of slavery might be determined. In the years after the act, Kansas attracted pro-slavery settlers, free staters, and abolitionists, each with a different understanding of what settlement meant. A farm was not only a farm. A cabin was not only a shelter. A town was not only a cluster of buildings. In this political climate, residence itself became an argument. For pro-slavery men, Kansas mattered because its admission as a slave state would help protect the political strength of slavery west of Missouri. Missouri already allowed slavery, and many pro-slavery Missourians looked across the border at Kansas with alarm. If Kansas became a free state, Missouri would have a free state neighbor on its western side. That could change the security of slaveholding in the region and shift the balance of power in national politics. To them, the Kansas question was not distant. It was immediate, local, and defensive. For Free Staters, Kansas represented a different kind of chance. Many opposed the spread of slavery into the territory. Some were not abolitionists in the most radical sense, but they wanted Kansas kept free from slave labor. Others were abolitionists who understood Kansas as part of a larger moral and political struggle against slavery itself. These groups did not always share identical motives, but in the Kansas contest, they often moved in the same direction, toward keeping slavery out, building free state institutions, and demonstrating that organized settlement could defeat pro-slavery power. This is where popular sovereignty began to change character. The doctrine imagined that voters in the territory would express the will of the people. But in Kansas, migration was political. Emigrant parties, local associations, and territorial organizers understood that the outcome depended on who arrived, where they settled, how they voted, and whether they could remain long enough to turn presence into authority. The legal question of slavery was being answered by physical movement. The Kansas Historical Society records that between 1855 and 1860, 98,605 emigrants arrived in Kansas Territory. That number belongs to the later sweep of the territorial period, but it gives a sense of how rapidly the question of Kansas became a question of population. People did not merely observe the conflict. They entered it by relocating. Some came with families. Some came as single men. Some came with plans to cultivate land bought from the United States government. The land price detail was plain enough. Emigrants committed to purchase government land at $1.25 per acre. Yet even that ordinary transaction sat inside extraordinary politics. A land claim could become a vote. A vote could become a weapon. A settlement could become a fortification in all but name. The ground itself mattered. Kansas was not an isolated territory far from existing power. It lay beside Missouri, a slave state, with people, roads, rivers, towns, and political networks already in place. The doctrine of popular sovereignty assumed a territorial community, but Kansas had to form that community while an organized neighboring population watched and intervened. Eastern Kansas, especially, could not be separated from western Missouri. The border was a line on a map, but people could cross it. They could attend meetings, carry news, bring weapons, escort settlers, intimidate opponents, or appear at elections. Before anyone could debate the fine principles of self-government, they had to confront the rougher problem of who was actually on the ground. The different factions also brought different definitions of legitimacy. A pro-slavery settler might see himself as protecting lawful property rights and the political future of the slaveholding South. A free stater might see himself as defending the territory from being captured by outside force. An abolitionist might see the entire struggle as a moral crisis that could not be left to compromise. Each side could speak the language of rights, and each side could accuse the other of corrupting the process. Popular sovereignty did not remove the slavery question from national conflict. It gave national conflict a local stage. That stage was built quickly. Territorial politics depended on settlement patterns, county organization, election rules, and the authority of territorial officials. But before those structures could settle into routine, they were pulled into the slavery fight. Meetings and conventions became tests of strength. Newspapers would later become targets because they did not merely report politics, they helped create political identity. Towns became symbols because they concentrated people, presses, supplies, and leadership. Lawrence, which would soon stand at the center of the Free State cause, did not matter only because people lived there. It mattered because organized settlement made anti-slavery politics visible. Even before the most famous outbreaks of violence, the atmosphere was unstable. Popular sovereignty required trust that elections would be fair, that voters would be recognized as legitimate, that opponents would accept results, and that local government would reflect an actual local majority. Kansas lacked that trust from the beginning. Pro-slavery settlers and free staters did not enter a neutral civic space. They entered a contested territory where both sides suspected the other of trying to manufacture the electorate. There was a deeper contradiction here. The Kansas-Nebraska Act left the slavery question to the settlers, but it made control of settlement the key to the answer. If the future of slavery depended on who lived in Kansas, then moving people into Kansas became political strategy. If elections determined the law, then influencing elections became essential. If the presence of an opponent threatened the future, then intimidation could be rationalized as defense. In that setting, the line between organizing and coercion became thin. The language of local choice also hid the pressure of national expectation. Kansas was not being watched only by its inhabitants. The territory became a test case for the country. Northern anti-slavery observers looked to Kansas for proof that slavery's expansion could be stopped. Southern and pro-slavery observers feared that losing Kansas would signal a broader defeat. Men and families arriving in the territory carried these larger meanings with them. They were settling land, but they were also standing in for political forces much larger than themselves. This is why ordinary acts in Kansas became charged. To build a cabin could mean to anchor a political claim. To form a town company could mean to secure a foothold for one side. To travel toward the Wakarusa River or settle near the Missouri line could place a person inside a landscape already being measured for advantage. To gather at a polling place could mean more than casting a ballot. It could mean confronting men who believed the election might decide the fate of slavery in the West. In theory, popular sovereignty promised to reduce conflict by letting the people decide. On the ground, it invited conflict over the meaning of the word people. Were the people only permanent residents? Did recently arrived settlers count? What about men who came from Missouri for a day, claiming an interest in the outcome? What about organized immigrants sent by anti-slavery efforts? What about those who believed their opponent's very presence was part of an illegitimate scheme? Kansas exposed the weakness of a doctrine that depended on calm conditions where none existed. The territory was new, but the slavery conflict was old. The institutions were forming, but the factions were already hardened. The law imagined ballots, but men also carried weapons. It imagined neighbors, but many settlers arrived already convinced that the people across the road, across the creek, or across the border were enemies of their future. The result was not immediate civil war in the formal sense. It was something more jagged, a struggle over settlement, legitimacy, and fear. Pro-slavery settlers, free staters, and abolitionists each tried to make Kansas into evidence for their cause. The territory became a place where political theory met mud roads, river landings, claims, rumors, and armed pressure. Every movement of people changed the balance. Every election promised a verdict and threatened a crisis. And because Kansas stood beside Missouri, the contest could not remain contained within Kansas itself. The people trying to decide the territory's future were not separated from an older slave state by distance or difficulty. They were divided by a border that could be crossed. That fact would turn popular sovereignty from a territorial experiment into a border struggle, with eastern Kansas and western Missouri becoming the contested ground where voting, intimidation, raiding, and retaliation began to merge. The border mattered because it made the crisis movable. A political struggle that might have unfolded slowly inside one territory instead developed along a line that people could cross, recross, and use. Kansas was new, but Missouri was not. On the eastern edge of Kansas territory stood a slave state with settled counties, roads, river connections, political networks, and men who believed the future of Kansas would directly affect their own security and power. That proximity gave the conflict its shape. Eastern Kansas and western Missouri became the central ground of Bleeding Kansas, not simply because they were neighbors, but because the border made action easier. A man did not have to travel across half a continent to influence the territorial contest. From western Missouri, he could move into Kansas to attend a meeting, threaten a settlement, cast a ballot, or join a raiding party, then return across the line. For free state settlers in eastern Kansas, Missouri was not an abstract pro-slavery influence. It was immediate. It was nearby. It was the place from which pressure could arrive with little warning. This was the geography that turned popular sovereignty into something far rougher than a vote. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had placed the slavery question in the hands of the territory's residents. But along the Missouri border, the meaning of resident could be contested in practice. Who was genuinely part of Kansas? Who had come to settle and who had come only to influence the result? Who could appear at a polling place and claim a voice in the territory's future? These questions were not only legal, they were physical. They were decided in crowded voting places, on roads into Kansas, and in the uneasy knowledge that armed men could move faster than institutions could respond. The name that attached to many of those pro-slavery outsiders was border ruffians. The term was used for Missourians who crossed into Kansas to influence elections and intimidate free state settlers. It was not a neutral phrase. It carried accusation, fear, and political meaning. To free state observers, the border ruffian represented the collapse of the promise that Kansas would decide its own future through legitimate local choice. He was the outsider who entered the territory not to build a life there, but to bend the vote, frighten opponents, and strengthen the pro-slavery cause by force or threat. For pro-slavery Missourians, the stakes were close to home. Kansas was not a distant experiment. It was the territory directly to the west. If Kansas became a free state, Missouri would no longer be bordered on that side by a slave-holding political ally or buffer. The contest over Kansas therefore felt, to many pro-slavery men in Missouri, like a defensive struggle as much as an expansionist one. The Free State movement in Kansas appeared not only as a rival political project, but as a threat growing beside them. That sense of threat helped produce a border politics built on vigilance and intervention. The line between Missouri and Kansas did not function like a wall. It functioned more like a hinge. Across it moved people, rumors, weapons, newspapers, warnings, and plans. A territorial meeting in Kansas could be discussed in Missouri. A free state settlement could be watched from across the border. A disputed election could draw men who did not intend to remain in Kansas, but did intend to affect its outcome. This is why eastern Kansas became so important. It was the first contested face of the territory for many migrants and organizers. It lay closest to Missouri's power and to the routes by which people entered. Towns, claims, river crossings, and roads in this region became more than local features. They became part of the machinery of the conflict. Whoever could organize people there, protect settlements there, and shape elections there could claim influence over the future state. Western Missouri, in turn, became a staging ground. Its closeness gave pro-slavery forces a practical advantage in the earliest phase of the struggle. They could enter Kansas in groups, often with the confidence that retreat was possible. They could act inside the territory without necessarily accepting the obligations of permanent settlement. This blurred the line between political participation and invasion. It also made intimidation a tool of electoral strategy. If free state settlers could be discouraged from voting, driven away from claims, or made to fear public organization, the pro-slavery cause could gain power before Kansas had stable institutions of its own. The result was a borderland in which ordinary political acts took on a military character. Voting was not only voting. It was a contest over who could appear, who could stand their ground, and who could claim legitimacy afterward. Settlement was not only settlement, it was evidence. A cabin, a town site, a newspaper office, or a meeting hall could become proof that one side had numbers and staying power. Movement itself became political. A group crossing from Missouri into Kansas might be described by one side as citizens defending their interests, and by the other as armed intruders corrupting the territory. The border also made retaliation easier. Violence rarely stayed isolated when the people involved could identify nearby communities as enemy ground. A raid in one place could produce revenge in another. An intimidation campaign could harden into armed defense. Each crossing of the line added to the fear that the other side was not merely competing, but preparing to dominate. In that atmosphere, rumor had force. The report of men gathering in Missouri could alarm free state settlers in Kansas. The report of anti-slavery organization in Kansas could bring pro-slavery men across the border. The map itself encouraged escalation. This was one of the defining features of Bleeding Kansas. The conflict was territorial, but not contained. The legal question concerned Kansas. The practical struggle joined Kansas to Missouri. Missouri's presence gave pro-slavery intervention depth, manpower, and a place of return. Kansas's open settlements gave free state organizers space to build towns and institutions, but also exposed them to attack. The border made both sides imagine the other as advancing, encroaching, and preparing for the next move. Over time, the language of the conflict would develop its own hard edges. Border ruffians became the label for Missourians crossing into Kansas to influence elections and intimidate free state settlers. Later, another term would rise in the opposite direction: Jayhawkers. Missourians used that label for Kansans, and it would become associated with free state raiding forces. Together, the two names would help define a world in which political identity and border violence became inseparable. To call someone a border ruffian or a jayhawker was to place him inside a story of menace, retaliation, and cause. But in this stage of the crisis, the essential fact was still geographic. Kansas and Missouri were not separated by enough distance to let the experiment of popular sovereignty proceed in calm isolation. The older slave state stood immediately beside the new territory whose future was unresolved. That closeness altered everything. It meant that elections could be invaded, settlements could be threatened, and political fear could travel quickly in both directions. The line between Missouri and Kansas was supposed to mark jurisdictions. In practice, it became a corridor of conflict. It connected the national slavery dispute to local roads and river landings. It allowed men who did not agree on the rules to meet at the same polling places. It turned settlement into strategy and intimidation into a political instrument. And once geography became strategy, migration itself became more than movement. To enter Kansas, to claim land, to build a town, and to remain there became a way of voting before the ballot was cast. Anti-slavery organizers understood that. They would begin to treat settlement as a deliberate plan, sending people into Kansas not only to live, but to change the balance of power on the ground. If the border made politics movable, then migration became a kind of campaign. The struggle over Kansas was not only fought by men crossing from Missouri to intimidate voters or defend slavery. It was also fought by people who entered the territory with trunks, tools, claims, and plans for towns. To settle in Kansas was to alter the future electorate. To build a cabin was to help create the political body that popular sovereignty said would decide the fate of slavery. That idea stood at the center of the anti-slavery settlement effort associated with Eli Thayer and the New England Emigrant Aid Company. The company's strategy was simple in outline, but powerful in consequence. Help anti-slavery settlers move west, establish themselves in Kansas territory, and make their presence count. It did not rely only on speeches in Eastern meeting halls or protests against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It treated the map itself as the place where the argument had to be made. Kansas had been open to decision by settlement and vote. That meant numbers mattered. If enough anti-slavery settlers arrived, stayed, claimed land, organized towns, and participated in territorial politics, then Kansas might enter the Union as a free state. If pro-slavery settlers and their allies controlled the same process, Kansas might become a slave state. In that setting, migration was not background movement. It was a political instrument. The New England Emigrant Aid Company emerged from that logic. Associated with Eli Thayer, it represented a form of organized anti-slavery action that differed from immediate confrontation. Its answer to the crisis was not only denunciation, but placement. It encouraged people to go to Kansas, and by going, to become part of the legal and political population that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had empowered. Popular sovereignty had made settlers into decision-makers. The company acted as though the first task was to make sure the right settlers were there. This was not settlement as an accidental byproduct of expansion. It was directed settlement. The emigrants were not just leaving one region for another because land was available. They were entering a contested territory where their presence had meaning beyond their own farms and households. Every party that arrived under anti-slavery auspices carried with it the possibility of a vote, a town meeting, a newspaper, a local institution, and a claim of legitimacy. The first New England Emigrant Aid Company settlers went to Kansas Territory in 1854, the same year the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the contest. One documented party included 29 men who reached Kansas City, Missouri on July 29, 1854. That detail matters because Kansas City was not safely distant from the conflict. It stood in Missouri, the neighboring slave state whose western counties were already bound to Kansas by roads, ferries, trade, and political alarm. The anti-slavery settlers did not approach Kansas from an empty edge. They entered through a region where their movement could be seen, measured, and opposed. From Kansas City, that party moved toward the Wakarusa River. The route was practical, but it was also symbolic of the whole struggle. The emigrants came through Missouri and pressed into eastern Kansas, the same border zone where the contest over voting, intimidation, and settlement would become most intense. Their path showed how impossible it was to separate migration from the larger crisis. A group of settlers walking, riding, or hauling supplies toward a river valley was also changing the balance of local power. The Wakarusa River lay within the landscape that would become central to the Free State presence in eastern Kansas. At this stage, the movement was still fragile. A settlement effort began with people, but it also required shelter, supplies, land claims, roads, and cooperation. The company could assist and encourage, but those who arrived still had to endure the work of making a community in a politically hostile environment. Their success depended not only on conviction, but on staying power. That staying power was crucial. Popular sovereignty assumed that residents of the territory would determine the status of slavery. But the word residence could not be separated from the act of becoming resident. Who arrived first? Who remained through hardship? Who could bring others? Who could build institutions strong enough to survive pressure? The New England Emigrant Aid Company's strategy recognized that politics in Kansas would not begin only on Election Day. It began earlier, in the movement of bodies into the territory and in the formation of communities that would later speak as political actors. This is why the company alarmed pro-slavery observers. Anti-slavery migration looked like a peaceful version of conquest by population. It did not need to begin with gunfire to be understood as a threat. If the future of Kansas depended on the will of its settlers, then organized settlement could be seen as an attempt to capture that will before the vote occurred. The emigrant became, in effect, a political unit. The same logic worked on both sides synergistically. Pro-slavery men understood that Kansas could not be allowed to fill with anti-slavery towns if it was to become a slave state. Free state settlers understood that remaining scattered and unsupported would leave them vulnerable. The company's efforts therefore fit into a broader competition over geography and legitimacy. Town sites, river access, land claims, and communication routes all mattered because they shaped who could gather, organize, and defend a political claim. There is a quiet but important distinction here. The New England Emigrant Aid Company did not make migration political all by itself. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had already done that by placing the slavery question into the hands of settlers. What the company did was respond to the law on its own terms. If Congress said the people of the territory would decide, then anti-slavery organizers would help create that people. If political authority would grow out of settlement, then settlement had to be planned. The result was a new kind of frontier politics. The Western movement of immigrants was no longer treated only as family ambition, land hunger, or economic opportunity. In Kansas, it became part of a national struggle. A man who joined an emigrant party might be seeking land, work, or a new beginning, but he was also entering a contest watched from far beyond the territory. His cabin could be counted as evidence. His town could become a statement. His vote, when the time came, could help decide whether slavery would expand. This gave ordinary acts an unusual weight. Choosing a route, reaching Kansas City, moving toward the Wakarusa River, selecting a claim, and helping establish a settlement all became part of the machinery of conflict. The materials of migration, wagons, tools, provisions, letters of encouragement, and land claims, belonged to the same story as ballots and territorial laws. Before Kansas became known for raids and retaliations, it was already being contested through organized arrival. The company's settlement program also helped connect Kansas to distant anti-slavery networks. Eli Thayer's idea depended on the belief that people in New England and other northern communities could affect events in the territory by sending settlers, resources, and attention. Kansas was not isolated, and neither was Missouri. Each side drew meaning from outside the territory. What happened along the Wakarusa or at a new town site could become part of a national argument over whether popular sovereignty was fair, whether slavery could be contained, and whether organized freedom could stand against organized pro-slavery power. Yet the Emigrant Aid Strategy carried risks. By making settlement a political instrument, it also made settlements into political targets. A town founded by anti-slavery emigrants was not just a collection of houses. It could be read by its opponents as a headquarters, a challenge, and a promise of future votes. The more successful the strategy became, the more visible its communities became. That visibility would soon center on one place above all. The organized anti-slavery movement in Kansas needed a foothold, a gathering point, and a symbol. Out of the early movement of emigrants, one town would rise to carry more meaning than its streets and buildings could contain. It would be named Lawrence, for Amos Lawrence, treasurer of the New England Emigrant Aid Company. And because it came to embody the Free State cause, it would also become something more dangerous than a settlement. It would become a target. The town that became Lawrence grew out of that risk, the risk that a settlement could be understood as an argument. It stood in Kansas territory, not simply as a place where emigrants had stopped, claimed land, and begun to build, but as evidence that the anti-slavery migration strategy could take physical form. Roads, cabins, meeting places, and printed words could become part of the contest. A community could gather people, coordinate action, and make visible a political future that pro-slavery men hoped to prevent. Lawrence was tied from the beginning to the organized settlement effort associated with the New England Emigrant Aid Company. That connection mattered. The company had not treated movement into Kansas as random migration. It had presented settlement as a way to influence the territorial balance, to bring free state voters into a place where popular sovereignty had made numbers politically decisive. When its early settlers moved from Kansas City, Missouri, toward the Wakarusa River in 1854, they were entering a landscape already charged by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They were not arriving after the political question had been answered. They were arriving because it had not been answered. The name Lawrence made that connection plain. The town was named for Amos Lawrence, treasurer of the New England Emigrant Aid Company. A name could serve as a marker of gratitude, but in this setting it also served as a signal. It linked a Kansas settlement to Eastern money, Eastern organization, and a deliberate Free State project. To supporters, that link gave the town stature. It suggested that the Free State cause had institutions behind it, that the effort to settle Kansas without slavery was not only the work of isolated families. To opponents, the same link could appear threatening. It suggested coordination. It suggested a plan. That is why Lawrence became important before it became famous for destruction. Its symbolic power did not begin with an attack. It began with recognition. Pro-slavery men and free state settlers alike could look at Lawrence and understand that it represented more than local improvement. It stood for one side of the territorial struggle, the side that wanted Kansas to enter the Union as a free state, and that used settlement, organization, newspapers, and political institutions to make that outcome more likely. In the logic of bleeding Kansas, visibility was dangerous. A scattered free state settler might be difficult to read as a political force. A town was different. A town could shelter meetings. It could receive new arrivals. It could become a center of communication. It could give people a place to gather when they felt threatened, and a place to identify when they described their cause to others. Lawrence began to carry that kind of meaning. It was a settlement, but it was also a sign that the Free State movement intended to remain. The struggle over Kansas had been framed as popular sovereignty, as though the territory could calmly count its residents and determine its future by local choice. But on the ground, the contest was never only about formal voting. It was also about who could build durable communities, who could maintain confidence, and who could create institutions strong enough to survive intimidation. Lawrence mattered because it became one of the most visible answers to those questions. It showed that the anti-slavery side was not merely protesting from a distance. It was planting itself in Kansas territory. That made the town a gathering point for organized resistance to pro-slavery power. The phrase should be understood carefully. Resistance in Lawrence did not mean one single action or one single organization. It meant a broader concentration of people and institutions associated with the Free State cause. The town became identified with anti-slavery politics, with the refusal to accept pro-slavery dominance as inevitable, and with the belief that Kansas could be organized against slavery through settlement and territorial action. In a place where law, voting, and force were already beginning to blur, such a center could not remain neutral in the eyes of its enemies. The geography of the conflict made this even more consequential. Lawrence stood in eastern Kansas, in the part of the territory most exposed to pressure from western Missouri. Earlier, the border had made interference easy. Men could cross from Missouri into Kansas, influence elections, intimidate settlers, and retreat back across the line. In that environment, a free state town in eastern Kansas was not merely a distant symbol. It was close enough to be watched, denounced, and eventually attacked. Its location placed it inside the main conflict zone, where territorial politics and border movement met. Lawrence also became important because it helped give the free state cause a visible address. Movements need language, but they also need places. A place makes a cause easier to imagine. For pro-slavery advocates, Lawrence could become shorthand for outside interference, abolitionist influence, and organized opposition. For free staters, it could become shorthand for perseverance and community. The same name could carry opposite meanings depending on who spoke it. That is one reason the town's symbolic role intensified so quickly. It was not just a site on a map. It was a word people could use when describing what they feared or defended. This symbolic role was sharpened by the methods of the anti-slavery settlement campaign. The New England Emigrant Aid Company's strategy treated migration as political action. Lawrence was one of the clearest physical results of that idea. The town showed that a plan formed outside Kansas could shape the territory inside Kansas. Its association with Amos Lawrence and the company made it harder for opponents to dismiss the free state presence as accidental. The town seemed to prove that anti-slavery settlers were not simply drifting west. They were being encouraged, assisted, and organized. That perception fed pro-slavery anger. To men who wanted Kansas open to slavery, Lawrence could look like an organized beachhead. If popular sovereignty depended on who lived in the territory, then organized anti-slavery migration threatened the outcome before ballots were cast. Every new free state settler represented a possible future vote. Every house made the movement harder to dislodge. Every institution made resistance more permanent. A free state town, then, was not merely evidence of settlement. It was evidence of political competition taking root. The meaning of Lawrence also helps explain why later attacks on the town would focus not only on people, but on property, presses, and buildings. The conflict in Kansas was not only a struggle over bodies at polling places or armed men on roads. It was also a struggle over communication and legitimacy. Newspapers could carry accounts of violence beyond the territory. Hotels, meeting spaces, and town institutions could function as headquarters or symbols. Lawrence became associated with these layers of meaning because it concentrated them. It was a community, but also a platform. That platform would become especially important as free state settlers began responding to pro-slavery authority with their own political organization. Lawrence, together with Topeka, would later be associated with the free state government that anti-slavery forces organized in opposition to the pro-slavery territorial legislature. That later development belonged to the widening split in Kansas authority, but its roots were already visible in Lawrence's early rise. A town that gathered free state settlers could become a place where political alternatives were imagined, debated, and defended. The danger was that the more Lawrence represented, the more it could be blamed for. In a calmer territory, a town named for a company treasurer might have remained a local fact, one detail in the story of Western settlement. In Kansas, it became evidence in a larger argument. Pro-slavery men could point to Lawrence as proof that outside anti-slavery forces were trying to capture the territory. Free state men could point to Lawrence as proof that their cause had substance and endurance. The town became a mirror in which each side saw the other's intentions. This is what made Lawrence a target before the first great public blow fell upon it. A target is not always chosen because of size alone. It can be chosen because of meaning. Lawrence embodied the free state cause in a way that scattered claims in isolated cabins could not. It gave anti-slavery Kansas a visible center. It gave pro-slavery Kansas a visible enemy. In a contest where settlement, voting, and intimidation had become inseparable, that visibility carried a cost. By the opening months of 1855, the territory was moving toward a test that was supposed to create lawful order. A territorial legislative election would be held, and in theory, popular sovereignty would begin to operate through ballots rather than threats. But the rise of Lawrence had already shown that neither side saw the contest as a neutral procedure. Communities had been built as political instruments. Borders had become routes of intervention. Settlements had become symbols. When the first territorial legislative election arrived in March 1855, the question was no longer only who had the right to vote. It was whether the process itself could be trusted by people who already believed the future of Kansas was under organized attack. The election came into a territory already trained to doubt the neutrality of its own institutions. Lawrence had become visible as a free state center. Missouri lay close enough for men, horses, weapons, and political purpose to move across the line with little delay. Popular sovereignty had promised that the residents of Kansas Territory would decide the slavery question for themselves. But by March 1855, the meaning of resident, voter, neighbor, and intruder had become contested before the first territorial legislature had even been chosen. That was the fragile setting for the first territorial legislative election. On paper, it was meant to bring order. Kansas needed a legislature, and the legislature was supposed to become the lawful voice of the territory. If the theory of the Kansas-Nebraska Act could work anywhere, it had to work here. Settlers would cast ballots. Ballots would determine political control, and that political control would guide the future status of slavery. But Kansas was not an isolated settlement district. It was a border territory beside Missouri, a slave state with direct access to the eastern edge of Kansas. The same geography that had made intimidation possible also made electoral intervention possible. Men did not need to migrate permanently into Kansas in order to affect its politics. They could cross the border, appear at polling places, cast votes, and return. In a system built around local choice, that movement struck at the heart of the promise. In March 1855, heavily armed Missourians crossed into Kansas and cast fraudulent ballots in the first territorial legislative election. The event was not merely a dispute over technical irregularities. It was a direct challenge to the central claim that popular sovereignty could produce a fair and accepted result. The ballot was supposed to settle what Congress had refused to settle. Instead, the ballot became another battlefield. The presence of armed outsiders changed the atmosphere of the election before the counting was complete. Voting depends not only on rules, but on confidence. Confidence that a polling place is open to qualified voters, that intimidation will not decide participation, and that the result will reflect the people legally entitled to vote. In Kansas, that confidence was already thin. Free state settlers believed organized pro-slavery forces were trying to control the territory. Pro-slavery men believed Kansas had to be kept from becoming a threat on Missouri's western border. When armed Missourians entered the process, the election became evidence for both fear and strategy. For pro-slavery forces, the stakes were immediate. A territorial legislature would write laws, structure authority, and give one side the advantage of official power. Control of that body meant more than symbolic victory. It meant the ability to define the rules under which political life in Kansas would continue. In a territory where every institution was still forming, the first legislature would help decide what counted as legal authority. For free state settlers and anti-slavery organizers, the election's contamination carried a different lesson. If people from outside Kansas could cross in force and help decide the legislature, then the system did not simply favor one side. It appeared to reward intervention. The doctrine of popular sovereignty had rested on the phrase, residents of the territory, but the border made that phrase vulnerable. A man could be in Missouri one day, in Kansas at a polling place the next, and back across the line after the damage was done. The map itself had become a loophole. The fraudulent voting helped install a pro-slavery territorial legislature. That outcome mattered because it converted a disputed election into disputed government. The problem was no longer only that illegal ballots had been cast. The problem was that a legislature born from that election could now claim to speak with the force of law. Once seated, it could act in the name of Kansas Territory, even while many in Kansas denied that it represented them. This was the deeper fracture. A stolen or corrupted election does not end when the votes are counted. It continues through every law, appointment, court, and enforcement action that follows from the result. In Kansas, those who rejected the election were not simply disappointed voters. They could argue that the political machinery itself had been captured at the moment of formation. That made obedience feel like submission to fraud, while resistance could be framed by opponents as defiance of lawful government. Popular sovereignty had been offered nationally as a compromise. It allowed Congress to avoid a direct decision over slavery in Kansas by sending the question into territorial politics. But the March election exposed a weakness in that approach. Popular sovereignty assumed a political community stable enough to define itself and peaceful enough to vote. Kansas had neither. Its electorate was still forming. Its towns were political statements. Its border was porous. Its settlers arrived with national expectations pressing on local events. Under those conditions, the vote did not cool the conflict. It concentrated it. The election also changed the emotional landscape of the territory. Before March 1855, free state settlers could still hope, however uneasily, that numbers and organization might prevail through recognized elections. They could build towns, recruit settlers, publish arguments, claim land, and wait for ballots to confirm their strength. After the legislative election, many had reason to doubt that ordinary participation would be enough. If a vote could be overwhelmed by armed outsiders, then settlement alone might not protect political rights. The question became not only how to win elections, but how to defend the meaning of an election. On the pro-slavery side, the result encouraged a different confidence. The legislature produced by the election could be presented as the legal government of the territory. Its supporters could insist that political authority had been established and that resistance to it was disorder. That claim would become powerful because legality and legitimacy were no longer the same thing in the eyes of the opposing sides. One side could point to institutions. The other could point to the means by which those institutions had been created. This separation between legal form and public trust is one of the central consequences of the March election. A legislature existed. Offices could be filled. Laws could be passed. But a large part of the territory's population, especially among free state and anti-slavery settlers, saw the foundation as compromised. The election had not settled who should govern Kansas. It had created two different interpretations of government itself, one based on the formal outcome, the other on the claim that fraud had made that outcome morally and politically invalid. The phrase border ruffians would carry much of this meaning. It referred to Missourians who crossed into Kansas to influence elections and intimidate free state settlers. In the story of the March election, the term was not an abstract insult. It described a practical method of power. Crossing the border allowed men to intervene without becoming permanent members of the community whose future they were shaping. Armed presence at the polls blurred the line between voting and coercion. Fraudulent ballots blurred the line between popular rule and imposed rule. For Kansas, the damage was immediate. The first territorial legislative election should have been a founding act. It should have marked the beginning of a shared political process, even among enemies. Instead, it became a memory of violation. Every later argument over law in the territory would carry this early wound. When pro-slavery officials spoke in the language of order, their opponents could answer with the memory of March. When free state settlers organized outside the official structure, their opponents could accuse them of rebellion. Both positions drew strength from the same broken origin. That is why the election did not simply fail. It transformed the conflict. Before it, the struggle had been over settlement patterns, town building, intimidation, migration, and the expected power of future votes. After it, the struggle included the legitimacy of the territorial government itself. Kansas now had an official legislature, but not a settled political community. It had lawmaking authority, but not consent. It had the machinery of popular sovereignty, but the process had become suspect at the moment it was most needed. The vote meant to answer the slavery question, instead deepen the crisis that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had set in motion. Congress had shifted the decision to the territory. The territory tried to vote. The border entered the ballot box. From that point forward, Kansas politics could not return to innocence. The election had shown that whoever controlled the rules could shape the future, and whoever doubted the rules might build another path around them. Out of that disputed legislature would come pro-slavery laws severe enough to convince anti-slavery settlers that the official government did not merely misrepresent them, but threatened them. And from that conviction would grow a rival political answer, centered in places like Lawrence and Topeka, where free state men began to act on the belief that if lawful authority had been born from fraud, another authority had to be made. The disputed election did not end when the ballots were counted. In Kansas Territory, the result became a governing fact. The pro-slavery legislature installed after the March election now claimed the power to write the rules under which the territory would live. For anti-slavery settlers, that was the next stage of the crisis. The problem was no longer only that Missourians had crossed the border to influence a vote. The problem was that the vote had produced an official body, and that body began to turn disputed power into law. This is where the promise of popular sovereignty became more than unstable. It became dangerous. In theory, the settlers of Kansas were to decide the slavery question through territorial politics. In practice, the side that controlled the legislature could shape who spoke, who organized, who published, and who could safely remain. A contested election had not merely chosen officers. It had handed one faction the machinery of government. The legislature that emerged from the fraudulent election was pro-slavery in character and severe in action. According to summaries of the period, such as those preserved by the American Battlefield Trust, it enacted harsh pro-slavery laws, including penalties connected to abolitionist literature. That detail matters because the struggle in Kansas was not only over labor, land, and ballots. It was also over information. Pamphlets, newspapers, speeches, and letters carried the arguments of the anti-slavery movement into cabins, town meetings, and distant Eastern audiences. To punish abolitionist literature was to treat anti-slavery ideas themselves as a threat to public order. For free state settlers, this confirmed a fear that had been building since the border first became politically active. If pro-slavery men could cross from Missouri, influence the election, and then use the resulting legislature to punish anti-slavery expression, the territorial government could not be understood as neutral. It appeared instead as an instrument designed to secure slavery's future in Kansas before a fair territorial majority could form against it. The laws also changed the emotional weather of the territory. A settler who had come to Kansas to farm could now find that political belief carried personal risk. A printer could become a target. A meeting could look like sedition to opponents. A town associated with anti-slavery organization could be described not as a settlement, but as a center of rebellion. The line between politics and policing narrowed, and fear. The line between speech and provocation narrowed with it. This is why the pro-slavery legislature's actions did more than anger anti-slavery Kansans. They forced a question: if the official government was born from a corrupted election, what did obedience to that government mean? Was compliance a duty to law or submission to fraud? Was resistance rebellion or self-defense? These were not abstract constitutional puzzles for people living on the border. They affected claims, newspapers, migration, defense, and the ability of communities to survive. The anti-slavery answer was to organize. Free state men began building their own political institutions, creating a rival claim to authority inside the same territory. Lawrence, already a visible anti-slavery center, remained central to this movement. Topeka also became part of the free state political response. Together, these places gave the opposition more than scattered anger. They gave it locations, meetings, procedures, and a public identity. This was a decisive shift. Earlier, anti-slavery strength in Kansas had often appeared through migration, settlement, and town building. The New England Emigrant Aid Company had treated population as strategy. Lawrence had shown how a community could become a political symbol. But after the disputed legislature began passing pro-slavery laws, settlement alone was no longer enough. Free state Kansans needed institutions that could speak in the language of authority. They needed conventions, officers, and a political framework that could say, "The official legislature does not represent us." The result was a territory with rival governments, in fact, if not equal recognition. The pro-slavery legislature claimed legal authority through the formal territorial structure. The Free State movement claimed moral and political legitimacy through the argument that the formal structure had been captured by fraud. Each side could point to a different foundation. One had official sanction. The other had the grievance of a broken election and the conviction that Kansas's true settlers were being overruled by outside force. In an archive report, this kind of division can look procedural. One legislature, one opposition movement, one set of laws, one rival organization. But on the ground, the meaning was more immediate. A person in Kansas territory now lived among overlapping claims of command. Which officers were legitimate? Which laws deserved obedience? Which meetings were lawful? Which newspapers had the right to publish? Which town represented order and which represented defiance? The answers depended on where a person stood and often on which side of the slavery question that person believed the territory must take. Pro-slavery men saw organized Free State resistance as a challenge to the recognized territorial government. Free State men saw that government as the product of an election distorted by armed cross-border intervention. Each side developed not only different goals, but different memories of how authority had been created. That is one of the reasons Bleeding Kansas escalated so quickly from electoral conflict into open confrontation. Once rival institutions existed, compromise became harder. If the pro-slavery legislature passed laws, Free State men could reject them as illegitimate. If Free State men held meetings and organized a government centered around Lawrence and Topeka, pro-slavery authorities could treat those acts as defiance. The same event could be described as civic organization by one side and insurrection by the other. Lawrence carried special weight in this new arrangement. It was not simply an anti-slavery town. It was a place associated with Free State organization, journalism, defense, and the larger migration effort that had brought northern settlers into Kansas. Its very visibility made it useful to its supporters and alarming to its enemies. A movement needs a place where people can gather, print, plan, and be seen. But a place that concentrates a movement also concentrates risk. Topeka, too, became part of the Free State political geography. Its importance lay in helping turn discontent into institutional form. The Free State government, centered in Lawrence and Topeka, represented an attempt to answer the pro-slavery legislature on political ground, not only through protest or settlement. The Free State movement was saying, in effect, that Kansas contained another public, another electorate, another claim to the future. By this point, popular sovereignty had nearly reversed its promised meaning. It had been offered as a way to avoid congressional settlement of slavery by leaving the question to local decision. But in Kansas, local decision had produced rival claims over who counted as the public. The pro-slavery side could point to territorial machinery. The Free State side could point to the fraud that had shaped it. Instead of resolving the slavery question, popular sovereignty produced a contest over the meaning of legitimacy itself. The severe pro-slavery laws gave this contest a sharper edge. Penalties against abolitionist literature showed that control over Kansas would include control over ideas. If anti-slavery writing could be punished, then the Free State press was not merely partisan, it was vulnerable. If Free State towns were treated as centers of resistance, then their buildings, newspapers, and meeting places could be seen as political targets. That danger gathered around Lawrence, Jangard, and Fox. The town had already become a symbol. Now, under the pressure of rival governments, it became something still more combustible, a symbol claimed by one authority and condemned by another. Its presses, hotels, and public spaces were not just local property. They represented the Free State answer to the pro-slavery legislature. By the spring of 1856, the conflict was no longer contained in accusations about a stolen election or arguments over territorial law. Kansas had two political realities occupying the same ground. One was backed by the contested territorial legislature and its pro-slavery enactments. The other was built by anti-slavery settlers who believed that obedience to such authority would surrender the territory to fraud and coercion. In that divided landscape, Lawrence stood exposed. The town's meaning had grown larger than its streets. Its newspapers carried the Free State cause outward. Its public buildings gave that cause a physical presence. Its name had become shorthand for organized resistance. And when a political struggle reaches the point where institutions themselves are treated as enemies, the destruction of a building or a press can be presented as the restoration of order. The crisis had moved from the ballot box to the law book, and from the law book to rival governments. The next movement would be physical. The arguments written into statutes and resolutions would soon be answered with men in the streets, presses broken apart, type scattered, and the most visible Free State town in Kansas placed under attack. By the spring of 1856, Lawrence no longer stood only as a settlement on the Kansas landscape. It had become a visible argument. The town's presses, its meeting places, its public buildings, and its association with the Free State movement made it more than a collection of homes and streets. To anti-slavery settlers, Lawrence represented organization and endurance. To pro-slavery opponents, it represented defiance. That was the danger of symbols in Kansas territory. Once rival governments claimed authority over the same ground, the material things that supported one side could be treated as political weapons. A newspaper office was not merely a business. A hotel was not merely a place for travelers. A town could be described as a center of resistance, and an attack on that town could be presented as an act of order. On May 21st, 1856, that logic came into the streets of Lawrence. Pro-slavery forces attacked the Free State town in what became known as the Sack of Lawrence. The name itself carries the sense of an assault not limited to a single military target. This was not only a clash between armed men. It was an attack on the institutions that had made Lawrence important in the territorial struggle, its newspapers, its property, and the public symbols of the Free State cause. Lawrence had been made vulnerable by its visibility. Earlier, the town had grown as a major Free State and anti-slavery center. It had been named for Amos Lawrence, treasurer of the New England Emigrant Aid Company, and it had become associated with organized resistance to pro-slavery power in the territory. That background mattered on the day of the attack. The pro-slavery forces were not striking at a nameless frontier village. They were striking at a place that had come to stand for the Free State answer to the pro-slavery legislature and its laws. The destruction began with the tools that carried Lawrence's message beyond the town. The presses were attacked. In Bleeding, Kansas, newspapers were not passive observers. They were instruments in the struggle over legitimacy, reputation, and political meaning. They recorded events, accused opponents, defended movements, and reached readers far from the immediate violence. In a territory where rival sides were trying to prove who represented law, settlement, and public will, the printed word had power. That is why the destruction of the Herald of Freedom was so important. The Herald of Freedom was an anti-slavery paper in Lawrence, and during the sack of Lawrence, its equipment was destroyed. The damage was not incidental. A press could be rebuilt, but breaking it was a direct attack on the town's ability to speak, organize, and report. The violence against the newspaper office showed that the conflict in Kansas was also an information war. Control of the story mattered almost as much as control of the road or the polling place. The details of the destruction were deliberately physical. The equipment of the Herald of Freedom was smashed, and its type was thrown into the Kansas River. Printing type was the small material alphabet from which arguments, accusations, announcements, and political defenses were made. To scatter it into the river was to turn language back into metal and silence. It was a symbolic act as much as a practical one. The message was that the Free State press could be broken, its words interrupted, and its authority humiliated. The Kansas River, already part of the geography of settlement and movement, became part of the memory of the attack. Type that had carried political speech was cast into the water. In that image, the border war's quieter forms of conflict become visible. The dispute over slavery's future in Kansas was fought with ballots and laws, but also with newspapers, names, rumors, and printed claims to legitimacy. Destroying a press was a way to strike at the machinery of persuasion itself. The attack did not stop with the newspapers. Pro-slavery forces looted Lawrence and burned or destroyed important Free State property. The looting mattered because it made the attack feel less like a narrow legal action and more like a public punishment. Property was taken or ruined. The town's material life was violated. To the people of Lawrence, the assault would have confirmed what many Free Staters already believed, that the official pro-slavery order in Kansas did not simply oppose them politically, but was willing to use force against the places where their movement lived. The most visible target was the Free State Hotel. Kansas Historical Society scholarship describes the Free State Hotel as a headquarters and symbol of the Free State cause. That made it a natural object of attack. In ordinary terms, a hotel suggests lodging, travel, and commerce. In Lawrence, this building carried a much heavier meaning. It gave the movement a public face. It was a place associated with organization, presence, and confidence. To damage or destroy it was to strike at the idea that the Free State movement had built something permanent. The attack on the Free State Hotel shows how buildings could become arguments in territorial Kansas. The Free State cause was not only expressed in resolutions or conventions. It occupied rooms. It gathered behind walls. It made itself visible in timber, brick, signs, and streets. The pro-slavery assault on that hotel therefore had both practical and symbolic force. It targeted a headquarters, but it also targeted the claim that Free Staters had a durable place in Kansas. The sack of Lawrence must be understood inside the sequence that brought it about. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had promised popular sovereignty, allowing residents of the territory to decide whether Kansas would become a free state or a slave state. But the process had become unstable almost from the beginning. Eastern Kansas and western Missouri formed a border zone where movement across the line could influence elections and intensify retaliation. In March 1855, heavily armed Missourians had crossed into Kansas and cast fraudulent ballots in the first territorial legislative election, helping install a pro-slavery territorial legislature. That legislature then enacted severe pro-slavery laws, including penalties against abolitionist literature. Anti-slavery settlers responded by organizing their own political institutions, centered in places such as Lawrence and Topeka. By May 21, 1856, those earlier steps had produced a territory with rival claims to authority. The sack of Lawrence was not an isolated eruption. It was the physical expression of a constitutional and political breakdown. If one side saw Lawrence as rebellion, then destroying its property could be framed as enforcement. If the other side saw the pro-slavery government as born from fraud and coercion, then the attack became proof that the official order had become an instrument of intimidation. That contradiction was central to Bleeding Kansas. The same event could be described in opposite languages. Pro-slavery forces could claim they were suppressing disorder. Free staters could see the destruction as an assault on lawful political resistance. The same broken press, the same burned or damaged building, the same looted property could be placed into competing stories about who had the right to rule Kansas. But the material facts remained. Lawrence was attacked. Presses were destroyed. The Herald of Freedom's equipment was broken, and its type was thrown into the Kansas River. The Free State Hotel, a headquarters and symbol of the anti-slavery cause, was targeted. Important Free State property was burned or destroyed. Looting accompanied the attack. Whatever language was used to justify it, the town had been made an example. The consequences reached beyond Lawrence because the town had already become a symbol beyond Kansas. Northern anti-slavery readers could understand the destruction of a newspaper as an attack on free expression and political dissent. Pro-slavery observers could understand the assault as a blow against an organized free state challenge. In both cases, the event traveled. It moved through print, speech, rumor, and political debate. The very presses that had been attacked represented the channels through which the meaning of Kansas violence would be carried outward. The sack of Lawrence also helped intensify the emotional rhythm of the border war. In a conflict built on suspicion and retaliation, an attack on a symbolic town did not end the matter. It deepened the sense that ordinary politics had failed. If elections could be corrupted, laws could be rejected, rival governments could form, and newspapers could be smashed, then each side would increasingly look beyond formal procedure for protection and revenge. This is why the date matters. May 21st, 1856, sits in a week when Kansas was already becoming a national crisis. In Washington, D.C., Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts had just delivered his Crime Against Kansas speech on May 19th and 20th in the old Senate chamber. As Lawrence was attacked, the struggle in Kansas was already being translated into the language of national accusation. One day after the sack of Lawrence, Sumner would be attacked at his Senate desk by Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina. The violence in Kansas and the violence in Washington were not the same event, but they belonged to the same political atmosphere. Lawrence showed that the territorial conflict could destroy presses, property, and public symbols. The Senate would show that the language of Kansas could provoke violence at the center of the federal government itself. By the end of that week in May, Bleeding Kansas was no longer only a border war on the Missouri line. It was becoming a national spectacle, carried from the streets of Lawrence to the floor of the United States Senate. The destruction in Lawrence gave the Kansas crisis a physical form. Shattered presses, looted property, and the Free State Hotel reduced as a symbol of organized anti-slavery resistance. But while those events unfolded in the territory, Kansas was already being argued over in another arena. In Washington, D.C., the same conflict had entered the old Senate chamber, where words carried the weight of accusation, honor, party allegiance, and sectional fear. On May 19th and 20th, 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech that became known as the Crime Against Kansas. Sumner was an anti-slavery senator, and his subject was not merely a disputed election or a local outbreak of disorder. He treated Kansas as evidence of a national wrong. The territory, in his telling, was not only suffering from scattered violence, it had been made the scene of a larger political crime, one tied to the effort to force slavery into a place where settlers were supposed to decide the question for themselves. That setting matters. Sumner spoke in the old Senate chamber, not in a courthouse in Kansas, not at a Free State meeting in Lawrence, and not along the Missouri border. He spoke inside the federal legislature, before the country's political class, in a room where the Kansas-Nebraska Act had already made its consequences impossible to ignore. The doctrine of popular sovereignty had promised that local settlers could determine the status of slavery, but by May of 1856, Kansas had shown how unstable that promise could become when migration, intimidation, fraudulent voting, rival governments, and armed force all surrounded the act of political choice. Sumner's speech arrived at the moment when the territorial dispute was becoming national theater. The same week that pro-slavery forces attacked Lawrence, the Senate heard Kansas described as a moral and political indictment. The distance between Washington and the Kansas River did not soften the conflict. Instead, it magnified it. In Kansas, men fought over towns, newspapers, ballots, and territorial authority. In Washington, senators and representatives fought over what those events meant, who was responsible, and whether the violence in the territory was a warning about the future of the Union itself. The speech also pulled individual national figures into the center of the controversy. Sumner's attack was directed against the pro-slavery cause in Kansas and against the political forces that had made the crisis possible. Among the figures connected to the debate were Andrew Butler of South Carolina and Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. Butler stood as a prominent South Carolina senator associated with the slaveholding South. Douglas, from Illinois, was the leading political architect of the Kansas-Nebraska framework, the man whose doctrine of popular sovereignty had helped open Kansas territory to this struggle. These names show that the Kansas crisis was no longer confined to settlers and bordermen. It now touched the reputations of senators, the pride of states, and the credibility of national policy. Douglas's role linked the crisis to the legislative mechanism that had created it. Butler's presence in the controversy linked it to Southern political honor and the defense of slavery's place in the territories. Sumner's speech, by naming and condemning the forces behind Kansas's suffering, turned the territory into a case before the nation. The form of the speech was political, but its consequences became physical. On May 22, 1856, 2 days after Sumner finished speaking, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina entered the Senate chamber and attacked him at his desk. Brooks was not a senator. He was a member of the House of Representatives, but he came into the Senate space as a defender of Southern honor after Sumner's anti-slavery speech, and the attack made the meaning of Kansas even more explosive. The image was stark: a senator seated at his desk in the chamber of the United States Senate, struck by a representative from South Carolina because of words spoken about Kansas. The violence did not occur on a territorial road or near a disputed polling place. It happened at the center of the federal government. That is why the event became so powerful. It suggested that the habits of intimidation and retaliation associated with Bleeding Kansas were not safely contained on the frontier. They had reached the place where national argument was supposed to remain argument. The caning of Sumner and the sack of Lawrence were separate events. One involved a Free State town in Kansas Territory. The other involved a United States senator in Washington. But the timing joined them in the national mind. Sumner spoke on May 19th and 20th. Lawrence was attacked on May 21st. Brooks struck Sumner on May 22nd. In 4 days, the Kansas question moved through speech, destruction, and personal assault. The sequence made it difficult to treat Bleeding Kansas as a distant local disturbance. For anti-slavery observers, the attack on Sumner seemed to confirm what events in Kansas had already suggested, that the slave power, as they described it, would use force when argument failed. The destruction of presses in Lawrence and the beating of an anti-slavery senator could be understood as different expressions of the same coercive politics. One silenced newspapers. The other punished speech in the Senate. Both made violence part of the argument over slavery's expansion. For pro-slavery men and their allies, the issue could be framed differently, as resistance to insult, defense of honor, and rejection of Northern denunciation. That difference in interpretation was part of the danger. The same act could be seen by one side as brutality and by another as justified retaliation. The country was no longer only divided over whether Kansas would be free or slave. It was divided over what counted as lawful politics, what counted as provocation, and what forms of force could be excused. The old Senate chamber became, for a moment, an echo chamber for the border war. Kansas had produced rival governments, rival newspapers, rival claims of legitimacy, and rival versions of order. Washington now produced rival meanings for the violence itself. Sumner's Crime Against Kansas speech gave the anti-slavery North a language of indictment. Brooks's attack gave that language a martyr-like image, the wounded senator at his desk, punished for speaking against the pro-slavery course in Kansas. This mattered because bleeding Kansas was always more than a tally of raids and killings. It was also a contest over public understanding. Newspapers, speeches, legislative reports, and political meetings shaped how Americans imagined the territory. The sack of Lawrence showed that presses could be targeted because information was power. The assault on Sumner showed that speech itself could become a battlefield. Kansas was being fought in settlements and along roads, but it was also being fought in the national imagination. By late May of 1856, the crisis had entered a new phase. The territorial struggle had already undermined confidence in popular sovereignty. The pro-slavery legislature and the Free State answer had produced competing claims to authority. Lawrence had been struck as a symbol of organized resistance. Then Washington supplied another symbol, the Senate desk as a site of violence, the national chamber as a place where the Kansas conflict could no longer be kept at a distance. The week was not finished. News and rumor moved unevenly across the country, and men in Kansas did not experience events in Washington and Lawrence as cleanly separated chapters. The atmosphere was one of fear, anger, and retaliation. The destruction of Lawrence helped convince some anti-slavery men that pro-slavery force would continue unless answered directly. Within days, near Pottawatomie Creek in Franklin County, Kansas Territory, that logic would take a darker turn. The violence that had echoed in the Senate would return to the Kansas landscape, not as a speech or a symbolic attack on property, but as killing in the night. The violence that had echoed from Lawrence to Washington returned, in Kansas, to a darker and more intimate scale. The sack of Lawrence had destroyed presses, damaged property, and struck at the symbols of the Free State cause. The caning of Charles Sumner had shown that the same conflict could enter the United States Senate and become physical there. But near Pottawatomie Creek in Franklin County, Kansas Territory, the crisis took another form. It moved from public spectacle to night action, from political theater to targeted killing. On the night of May 24th to May 25th, 1856, John Brown and a small anti-slavery party killed 5 pro-slavery men near Pottawatomie Creek. The victims named in Kansas Historical Society scholarship include 3 Doyles, Allen Wilkinson and William Sherman. The killings became one of the most infamous moments in Bleeding Kansas, not because they were the first violent acts in the territory, but because of what they revealed about the direction of the conflict. Retaliation was no longer only a threat or a slogan. It had become an operation carried out by men who believed that violence had to be answered with violence. The timing mattered. The attack came only days after the sack of Lawrence on May 21, 1856. In the Free State imagination, Lawrence had been a central place, a town associated with organized anti-slavery settlement, newspapers, political resistance, and defense against pro-slavery authority. When pro-slavery forces struck Lawrence, destroyed newspaper equipment, threw type into the Kansas River, and targeted the Free State Hotel as a headquarters and symbol of the movement, the act sent a message beyond the physical damage. It said that anti-slavery organization in Kansas could be punished in public. For some Free State men, that message produced fear. For others, it produced anger. For John Brown, it appears to have confirmed a harsher conclusion, that the pro-slavery side would continue to use force unless met by force. That conclusion was not unique to Brown, but Brown acted on it in a way that shocked even many people who opposed slavery. The Pottawatomie killings forced the anti-slavery movement in Kansas to confront an uncomfortable question. If pro-slavery intimidation had corrupted elections, enforced harsh laws, and attacked a Free State town, what kind of answer was morally and politically permissible? This is where the historical qualification is essential. Kansas Historical Society scholarship notes that the men killed near Pottawatomie Creek were pro-slavery men, but they had not been involved in the sack of Lawrence. That detail matters because it complicates any simple story of direct revenge. The killings came in the atmosphere created by Lawrence, but the victims were not the men who had sacked Lawrence. They were identified with the pro-slavery side in a territory where political identity had become dangerous, but the evidence preserved in that scholarship separates them from the specific attack on the Free State town. That distinction does not make the violence less important. It makes it more revealing. In a stable legal order, guilt is attached to acts, evidence, and judgment. In eastern Kansas in 1856, political identity itself was becoming a marker of danger. A man could be feared not only for what he had done, but for what he represented, whom he supported, and what his neighbors believed he might do. The line between punishment and preemption blurred. The line between military action and murder blurred. The line between self-defense and revenge blurred. Pottawatomie showed that bleeding Kansas was no longer only a contest over institutions. Earlier, the struggle had centered on the machinery of popular sovereignty. Who could vote, which ballots counted, which legislature had legitimacy, and which government spoke for Kansas territory. Then it had expanded into the destruction of public symbols, newspapers, buildings, hotels, and presses. At Pottawatomie, the struggle moved into households and local communities. The targets were individual men. The place was not a territorial capital, a legislative hall, or a public square. It was the countryside near a creek. That shift changed the emotional map of the conflict. Violence in Lawrence had been visible and symbolic. Violence near Pottawatomie Creek carried a different terror. It suggested that political conflict could arrive at night, among neighbors, and that the dividing line between ordinary settlement and armed conflict had nearly disappeared. Families in the territory could no longer think of politics as something carried on only at elections, conventions, or newspaper offices. Political allegiance could follow a person home. The victims' names also pull the event away from abstraction. The three Doyles, Allen Wilkinson and William Sherman, were not simply entries in a casualty count. They were men living in the same contested territory as their killers, in a region where settlement, ideology, fear, and rumor overlapped. They were pro-slavery men, and that affiliation placed them inside one side of the territorial struggle. But the Kansas Historical Society's reminder that they were not involved in the sack of Lawrence prevents the event from being reduced to a direct exchange. Lawrence attacked, Lawrence avenged. The actual pattern was more unstable and more frightening. Violence spilled outward from one event to another, striking people who stood within the opposing political camp, even when they were not responsible for the immediate provocation. John Brown's role gave the killings a lasting historical force. Brown was not merely another Free State settler. He would become one of the most contested figures in the anti-slavery struggle, admired by some as a man of uncompromising conviction and condemned by others as a violent radical. In Kansas, his actions near Pottawatomie Creek helped shape that reputation. He represented a form of anti-slavery militancy that rejected patience, rejected confidence in normal territorial politics, and treated the conflict over slavery as a moral war already underway. But to understand Pottawatomie only through Brown's later image would flatten the event. In May of 1856, the territory itself was already under extreme pressure. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had promised that settlers could decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty. Instead, fraudulent voting, rival governments, severe pro-slavery laws, and the attack on Lawrence had made many settlers doubt that peaceful political process could function. Brown's violence did not create that collapse by itself. It emerged from it. At the same time, it deepened the collapse because it gave the pro-slavery side new grounds for fear and retaliation. That is why Pottawatomie became a turning point in the cycle of violence. It was not only an act of killing, it was a message interpreted by enemies, allies, and observers. Pro-slavery men could point to it as proof that Free State resistance was not merely political, but murderous. Anti-slavery moderates had to decide whether to distance themselves from Brown's methods or treat them as part of a necessary defense. Men on both sides could now imagine themselves as potential targets, and that imagination was powerful. Fear often moves faster than confirmed information. In a border conflict, rumor could travel along roads, rivers, settlements, and militia networks, hardening into certainty before facts were carefully known. The killings also changed the meaning of retaliation. Before this point, retaliation could be discussed as a possible response to intimidation, election fraud, or the destruction of free state property. After Pottawatomie, retaliation became part of the lived reality of the territory. One attack called forth another, and each new act was explained as a response to what came before. But the chain was never clean. The people punished were not always the people who had committed the prior act. Communities became responsible in the minds of their enemies for the violence of their factions. In that kind of war, identity becomes evidence. This was the danger at the heart of Bleeding Kansas. The border between Kansas and Missouri had already made movement easy for men who wanted to vote, raid, intimidate, or retreat. The political border between Free State and pro-slavery communities was even more unstable. It ran through towns, farms, roads, and families. After Pottawatomie, that internal border became more heavily charged. Men were not only defending positions on slavery, they were defending themselves against what they believed the other side was capable of doing next. The night near Pottawatomie Creek did not settle the conflict. It made settlement harder. It did not restore balance after Lawrence. It helped push the territory further into a pattern where each side narrated its own violence as necessary and the other side's violence as proof of barbarism. The language of the conflict would sharpen around that pattern. Missourians who crossed into Kansas to influence elections and intimidate Free State settlers were already known as border ruffians. Kansans associated with armed Free State raiding would increasingly be understood through another label, Jayhawkers. These names were not neutral descriptions. They were weapons of memory and accusation. After Pottawatomie, the people of eastern Kansas and western Missouri were not simply arguing over slavery's legal future. They were learning to see one another through the logic of raids, reprisals, and fear. After Pottawatomie, fear became part of the geography. It moved along roads, across rivers, through settlements, and over the Missouri line. A man's politics could make his cabin feel exposed. A rumor could make a road seem dangerous. A name could become an accusation before anyone had proved an act. That is why the language of Bleeding Kansas matters. The conflict was not only fought with rifles, ballots, presses, and torches. It was also fought with labels. Those labels helped people decide who belonged, who threatened them, and whose violence could be explained as defense. One of the most important of those labels was Border Ruffian. In the Kansas struggle, Border Ruffians were Missourians who crossed into Kansas to influence elections and intimidate Free State settlers. The phrase carried more than a description of movement. It implied invasion. It suggested that the political will of Kansas was being distorted by men who did not truly belong to the territory, but who entered it to force a pro-slavery result. The term fit the experience of many Free State settlers because the border itself had become the central weakness in popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had promised that the residents of Kansas Territory would decide whether slavery would be allowed there. But eastern Kansas lay beside western Missouri, a slave state with strong interest in the outcome. The line between them was not a wall. It was a crossing point. Men could enter Kansas, vote, intimidate, raid, and then withdraw back toward Missouri. That movement had already damaged the credibility of territorial politics. In March 1855, heavily armed Missourians crossed into Kansas and cast fraudulent ballots in the first territorial legislative election. The result helped install a pro-slavery territorial legislature. For Free State settlers, the phrase border ruffian became a way to summarize the whole betrayal. Popular sovereignty had been promised as local self-government, but the ballot box had been invaded. For pro-slavery Missourians, however, the situation looked different. Many saw Free State migration as an organized threat. The New England Emigrant Aid Company, associated with Eli Thayer, had sent settlers into Kansas Territory as part of an anti-slavery strategy. Lawrence, named for Amos Lawrence, became a center of that strategy and a symbol of Free State organization. To pro-slavery men in Missouri, this was not neutral settlement. It was political colonization, designed to put an anti-slavery state on Missouri's western border. Each side described the other as the aggressor. Each side told a story in which its own movement was defensive and the other side's movement was invasion. That is the logic of a border war. The other label, Jayhawker, developed from the opposite direction. It was used by Missourians for Kansans and later became associated with Free State raiding forces. Like border ruffian, it was not a calm term. It carried accusation, suspicion, and fear. To Missourians, a Jayhawker was not merely a Kansas man. The word came to suggest a raider, someone who might cross the landscape in the name of Free State politics, but leave behind loss, intimidation, or revenge. The two labels hardened identities. They reduced a complicated population into opposing figures. A Missourian crossing into Kansas could become, in Free State language, a border ruffian. A Kansan associated with armed Free State activity could become, in Missouri language, a Jayhawker. The names flattened motives. They made it easier to imagine whole communities as dangerous. This mattered because the violence in Kansas was often local and personal. It did not unfold only as armies meeting in open battle. It moved through settlements, farms, towns, roads, and river crossings. Political allegiance could be tied to where a person lived, which town he supported, which newspaper he read, which government he recognized, or which neighbors he feared. In that kind of conflict, labels helped turn ordinary proximity into suspicion. Eastern Kansas and western Missouri became a landscape shaped by this suspicion. The border gave both sides access and escape. It allowed political intervention to become physical intimidation. It allowed retaliation to be imagined as justice. A raid could be explained as a response to an earlier attack. A killing could be framed as prevention. A burned building or destroyed press could be presented not only as damage, but as a blow against a dangerous enemy network. The sack of Lawrence had shown how symbolic the violence could become. Lawrence was not attacked only as a collection of buildings. It was attacked because it represented organized Free State power. The Herald of Freedom was not only a newspaper, it was an anti-slavery voice. Its equipment was destroyed, and its type was thrown into the Kansas River. The Free State Hotel was not only a hotel, it functioned as a headquarters and symbol of the Free State cause. Pottawatomie showed another level of the same spiral. John Brown and a small anti-slavery party killed 5 pro-slavery men near Pottawatomie Creek in Franklin County on the night of May 24th to 25th, 1856. Kansas Historical Society scholarship makes an important distinction. The victims were pro-slavery men, but they had not been involved in the sack of Lawrence. Among those named were 3 Doyles, Allen Wilkinson, and William Sherman. That distinction mattered then, and it matters now, because retaliation did not always fall on those directly responsible for the earlier act. In a climate of fear, categories could replace evidence. Pro-slavery could become enough. Free State could become enough. Missouri could become enough. Kansas could become enough. The border war made collective identity dangerous. Once that happened, violence fed itself. A pro-slavery attack strengthened Free State claims that armed defense was necessary. A Free State killing strengthened pro-slavery claims that abolitionists were lawless and murderous. Fraudulent elections, rival governments, destroyed presses, burned property, and night killings all became part of competing moral accounts. Each side remembered its injuries clearly. Each side treated the other side's injuries as deserved, exaggerated, or strategically useful. The words border ruffian and Jayhawker worked inside that moral struggle. They did not simply name men after the fact. They prepared listeners to understand future events in a certain way. If a report said border ruffians were gathering, Free State settlers heard an old pattern returning: Missouri intervention, intimidation, and the destruction of local choice. If Missourians spoke of Jayhawkers, they heard a different pattern: Kansas-based raiding, anti-slavery militancy, and threats against pro-slavery communities. In this way, the border became more than a boundary between jurisdictions. It became a mental map. On one side, people imagined danger coming from the other. On both sides, the other side's movements were watched and interpreted. Political conflict became a system of anticipation. The tragedy of Bleeding Kansas is that the promise of popular sovereignty depended on trust, and trust was exactly what the border conflict destroyed. Popular sovereignty required people to believe that ballots would count more than intimidation. It required them to believe that residents, not outsiders, would determine the future of the territory. It required enough shared legitimacy that defeat in an election would be accepted as political loss, not treated as proof of conspiracy. By the mid-1850s, that shared legitimacy had broken down. Free state settlers had reason to see the pro-slavery territorial government as the product of fraud and force. Pro-slavery men had reason, in their own account, to see free state organization as an organized campaign to seize Kansas and threaten Missouri. The result was not merely disagreement. It was a collapse of the neutral ground on which disagreement could be settled. Kansas Historical Society estimates deaths from political violence in territorial Kansas at least 60 and possibly as many as 200, while noting that historians disagree on the total. The range itself tells us something. Bleeding Kansas was not a single battle with a clean casualty list. It was scattered, local, episodic, and often difficult to count. Its violence appeared in elections, raids, arrests, ambushes, assassinations, massacres, and retaliatory attacks. It left behind records, memories, claims, and counterclaims. The names survived because they captured the emotional structure of the conflict. Border Ruffian and Jayhawker were shorthand for fear. They allowed people to compress a history of invasion, settlement, fraud, raiding, and retaliation into a single word. But they also narrowed vision. They made enemies easier to recognize and harder to understand. That narrowing would shape the next stage of the Kansas crisis. Even as raids and reprisals continued to define life along the Missouri line, the struggle over Kansas also moved back into formal politics. Men still fought with weapons, but they also fought with conventions, constitutions, and claims of legal authority. The same divided territory that had produced border ruffians and Jayhawkers would now produce rival documents, each claiming to speak for Kansas and to decide whether its future would be slave or free. The same divided territory that had produced border ruffians and Jayhawkers now produced something quieter, but no less explosive: constitutions. On paper, a constitution looked like the opposite of a raid. It belonged to convention halls, committees, signatures, printed copies, and formal votes. It promised order. It claimed to turn settlement into government, and government into statehood. But in Kansas territory, even a constitution could become a weapon. Each proposed document carried a claim about who counted as the people of Kansas, who had the right to speak for them, and whether the future state would protect slavery or exclude it. This was the other battlefield of bleeding Kansas. Not the road at night, not the cabin door, not the burned hotel or the destroyed newspaper press, but the struggle to define legality itself. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had left the central question to popular sovereignty. In theory, settlers would determine whether Kansas entered the Union as a free state or a slave state. But by the time Kansas began producing state constitutions, the word settlers had already become contested. Fraudulent voting, cross-border pressure from Missouri, rival political organizations, and armed intimidation had made it difficult to say whose vote represented the territory. The argument was no longer simply about slavery. It was about legitimacy. That is why Kansas territory produced not one clear constitutional path, but several. The Topeka Constitution, the Lecompton Constitution, the Leavenworth Constitution, and the Wyandotte Constitution each belonged to a different attempt to settle the same question. They were not just drafts of government. They were rival answers to a crisis of authority. The Topeka Constitution emerged from the Free State response to the pro-slavery territorial government. After the disputed territorial election of March 1855, anti-slavery settlers did not accept the pro-slavery legislature as a fair expression of the territory's will. They had seen heavily armed Missourians cross into Kansas and cast fraudulent ballots. They had watched a legislature installed, under those conditions, enact severe pro-slavery laws, including penalties against abolitionist literature. To Free Staters, that government did not merely disagree with them. It lacked moral and political legitimacy, so they built their own institutions. The Free State movement centered much of its political energy in places like Lawrence and Topeka. Lawrence had already become a symbol of anti-slavery organization, journalism, and resistance. Topeka became associated with the effort to create a rival Free State government and a constitutional claim that Kansas should enter the Union without slavery. The Topeka Constitution represented that effort, a formal attempt by anti-slavery forces to move beyond protest and claim the authority to speak for Kansas. In this sense, the Topeka document was more than a legal instrument. It was a statement that the pro-slavery territorial legislature had forfeited credibility. Free Staters were saying, in effect, that if popular sovereignty had been corrupted at the ballot box, then the true people of Kansas had to organize separately. That claim was powerful, but it also deepened the territorial split. Kansas now had not only opposing factions, but opposing governments and opposing legal narratives. The pro-slavery answer came most clearly through the Lecompton Constitution. Drafted in Lecompton, Kansas in 1857, it was a pro-slavery statehood document. Its importance came from the fact that it offered a route for Kansas to enter the Union as a slave state, even after years of dispute over whether pro-slavery power in the territory rested on genuine settler support or on outside pressure and fraudulent procedure. Lecompton itself became part of the political geography of the conflict. Just as Lawrence stood as a visible center of the Free State cause, Lecompton became associated with the pro-slavery Constitutional Convention. There, the effort to turn Kansas into a slave state took written form. The document produced there did what constitutions are supposed to do. It framed a government and proposed a future. But in the Kansas crisis, that future was inseparable from the question of slavery and from the question of whether the convention truly represented the people who lived in the territory. The Lecompton Constitution would soon become a national controversy. President James Buchanan submitted it to Congress on February 2, 1858, and recommended admitting Kansas as a slave state. But Kansas ultimately was not admitted under that document. That failure mattered because it showed how difficult it had become to convert territorial power into recognized statehood when the process itself was distrusted. A constitution might be written, endorsed by powerful men, and sent to Washington, but still fail to settle the matter. Between these rival constitutional paths, Kansas remained suspended. Its people lived in a territory where different factions claimed different sources of authority. One side pointed to territorial institutions and pro-slavery legality. Another pointed to free state organization and the argument that corrupted elections could not bind the actual settlers. Meanwhile, the violence along the Missouri line gave every constitutional debate a sharper edge. The documents were written in ink, but they existed in a world where political defeat could mean intimidation, expulsion, or death. The Leavenworth Constitution belonged to another attempt to define Kansas through a statehood document. Like the Topeka, Lecompton, and Wyandotte constitutions, it reflected the instability created by popular sovereignty in practice. If the Kansas question could have been settled by one fair vote, one accepted legislature, and one uncontested convention, there would have been no need for this succession of rival proposals. The repeated constitution-making showed that the territory's political machinery had broken down. Each new document was both an effort to repair that breakdown and evidence that the repair had not yet succeeded. The existence of multiple constitutions also reveals something easy to miss if Bleeding Kansas is remembered only as bloodshed. The conflict was violent, but it was never only violence. It was also procedural. It turned on elections, conventions, petitions, legislative acts, and congressional recognition. Men fought over roads and towns, but they also fought over forms. Who could call a convention? Who could vote? What a ballot meant? Whether a territorial legislature was lawful, and whether Congress should accept a constitution as the voice of Kansas. This made Kansas a national test case in a deeper sense. The United States was not only watching whether slavery would expand, it was watching whether the democratic process could survive when the outcome carried such high stakes that both sides questioned the legitimacy of the rules. Popular sovereignty had been presented as a way to quiet the slavery issue by moving the decision from Congress to local settlers. In Kansas, that transfer did not quiet the issue. It made the local process the object of national suspicion. The Wyandotte Constitution finally became the successful path. Ratified in 1859, it became the basis for Kansas statehood. Under that constitution, Kansas entered the Union on January 29, 1861, as the 34th state and as a free state. By then, the long constitutional struggle had revealed how costly the road to statehood had become. Kansas had passed through rival governments, armed confrontations, raids, killings, destroyed presses, and repeated efforts to write its political future into law. The Wyandotte document did not erase the memory of the earlier constitutions. The Topeka, Lecompton, and Leavenworth efforts remained part of the territory's record of division. Each showed a different moment in the struggle to decide who had authority and what Kansas would become. Together, they mark the point where Bleeding Kansas must be understood not simply as a border war, but as a constitutional crisis inside a territory not yet admitted as a state. That is the quiet force of this chapter of the story. Kansas did not move from violence to law in a clean line. Violence and law overlapped. The same crisis that sent armed men across the Missouri border also sent delegates into conventions. The same struggle that destroyed the Herald of Freedom presses in Lawrence also produced printed constitutional claims. The same fear that hardened names like Border Ruffian and Jayhawker also hardened legal positions into rival documents. By the late 1850s, the question was no longer whether Kansas would produce a constitution. It had produced several. The question was which one the nation would accept and what acceptance would mean. Of all these documents, none carried the pro-slavery hope more directly into Washington than the Lecompton Constitution. Its path from a convention in Kansas to the desk of President James Buchanan would show how a territorial dispute could become a national test of party power, sectional loyalty, and the future of slavery itself. The struggle over Kansas had moved from cabins and roads into documents, but that did not make it peaceful. A constitution could appear orderly. It could be debated in a hall, copied into official language, and carried into Washington as if it represented a settled people. But in Kansas territory, every claim to legality had to pass through the memory of fraudulent elections, rival governments, destroyed presses, and armed retaliation. By the late 1850s, the question was not simply what a constitution said. It was who had the authority to write it, who had been excluded from its making, and whether Congress would accept it as the voice of Kansas. The Lecompton Constitution stood at the center of that question. It was drafted in Lecompton, Kansas, in 1857. In the geography of Bleeding, Kansas, Lecompton was not just another town. It became associated with the pro-slavery effort to carry Kansas into the Union as a slave state. The building most closely tied to that effort was Constitution Hall at 319 Elmore in Lecompton. It was a two-story building, plain in comparison to the scale of the national argument that gathered around it, but its importance came from use rather than size. It was connected to the pro-slavery Constitutional Convention, and through that connection, it became one of the physical places where the territorial crisis hardened into a statehood plan. The setting matters because Bleeding, Kansas can sometimes seem like a conflict of open spaces, river crossings, roads from Missouri, farms, ravines, and towns under threat. But power also gathered indoors. Men met in rooms, chose language, wrote clauses, claimed representation, and tried to convert territorial advantage into permanent law. The same territory that had seen men cross the Missouri line to influence elections now saw delegates attempt to define Kansas's future through a constitution. Violence and paperwork were not separate histories. They reinforced one another. The Lecompton Constitution was pro-slavery. That fact gave it its political purpose and its national weight. If accepted, it would have admitted Kansas as a slave state. In the wider arc of the conflict, that would have meant more than the legal status of slavery inside one territory. Kansas had become a test case for popular sovereignty, the doctrine that settlers would decide slavery's future through territorial politics. But the experience on the ground had badly damaged faith in that doctrine. Earlier votes had been tainted by cross-border intervention. Rival governments had claimed legitimacy. Free state settlers and pro-slavery forces had treated political organization as a form of combat. By the time the Lecompton document emerged, no constitution from Kansas could be understood as neutral. For pro-slavery leaders, the Lecompton Constitution offered a path through the confusion. It was a way to present Kansas to the nation as ready for statehood under a pro-slavery frame. It transformed a contested territorial position into a formal request: admit Kansas and admit it as a slave state. That was the document's central meaning. It tried to close the argument by moving it from Kansas territory to Congress. For Free State Kansans and anti-slavery observers, the same document represented something very different. It looked like the continuation of a pattern already familiar in the territory: political machinery used to produce a pro-slavery result despite deep opposition inside Kansas. The battle was no longer only over whether a settlement leaned free state or pro-slavery, or whether a newspaper could publish without being destroyed, or whether a road near the Missouri border was safe. It was now over whether Washington would ratify a pro-slavery claim as the legitimate constitutional voice of Kansas. That is why President James Buchanan's role became so important. On February 2nd, 1858, Buchanan submitted the Lecompton Constitution to Congress. He recommended admitting Kansas as a slave state. With that act, the Kansas conflict became more than a territorial dispute placed before federal lawmakers. It became a test of presidential power, party discipline, and sectional loyalty. Buchanan's recommendation carried the authority of the White House. It told Congress that the administration supported Kansas statehood under the Lecompton document. In ordinary circumstances, a president submitting a proposed state constitution might seem like part of the routine expansion of the Union. But Kansas was not ordinary. The very mechanisms meant to settle its future had helped create the crisis. Popular sovereignty had promised local decision. In practice, the local decision had been fought over by settlers, migrants, political societies, armed men, and cross-border forces. By sending the Lecompton Constitution forward and recommending Kansas as a slave state, Buchanan aligned the federal executive with the pro-slavery statehood path at the very moment when many Americans questioned whether that path truly represented Kansas. The document therefore carried two stories at once. On its surface, it was a constitution, a formal instrument for statehood. Beneath that surface, it was the result of years of contested authority. It stood downstream from the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which had made the Missouri Compromise restriction inoperative and opened the question of slavery in Kansas to popular sovereignty. It stood downstream from the contested election of 1855, when heavily armed Missourians crossed into Kansas and cast fraudulent ballots. It stood downstream from the pro-slavery territorial legislature and the Free State answer at Lawrence and Topeka. It stood downstream from the sack of Lawrence, from Pottawatomie, from the hardening names Border Ruffian and Jayhawker, and from the rival constitutional projects that tried to speak for a divided people. Lecompton's significance was that it tried to make the pro-slavery answer final. Yet it failed. Kansas was not admitted under the Lecompton Constitution. That outcome is essential to understanding the limits of pro-slavery power in the territory, even when supported by the president. The document reached Congress with Buchanan's recommendation, but it did not become the basis for Kansas statehood. The slave state path through Lecompton collapsed before it could close the Kansas question. The failure did not mean the crisis ended. It meant the crisis remained unresolved. Kansas had still not entered the Union. Its people still lived with rival memories of law and violence. The Lecompton effort had shown that a constitution could be drafted, endorsed by national power, and still fail to command acceptance. It had also shown that the struggle over Kansas was now inseparable from the struggle over the future of the country's political system. If a pro-slavery constitution from a divided territory could not settle the matter, then the old hope that procedure alone might contain the slavery conflict looked weaker than ever. Constitution Hall in Lecompton remained as a physical witness to that moment. Later, the building would be listed in the National Register of Historic Places on May 14, 1971, and designated a National Historic Landmark on May 30, 1974. Those later recognitions point back to the importance of what happened there. The building mattered because it held a chapter of the contest over whether Kansas would enter the Union slave or free. Its walls belonged to the world of conventions and documents, but the consequences reached far beyond the room. The Lecompton Constitution's defeat also shifted attention back to the territory itself. Congress had not admitted Kansas as a slave state under that document, but people in Kansas and along the Missouri border did not suddenly step out of danger. Political failure at the national level could deepen local bitterness. Men who had hoped Lecompton would secure a pro-slavery victory had seen that route blocked. Free state communities that had resisted the document could not assume that rejection in Washington would protect them on the ground. In the spring of 1858, Kansas remained a place where constitutional politics and violence lived side by side. The pro-slavery statehood path through Lecompton had failed, but the fears that produced and surrounded it did not disappear. Less than 4 months after Buchanan submitted the Lecompton Constitution to Congress, the territorial conflict would again be measured not in clauses and recommendations, but in bodies in a ravine in Lynn County, where the border war revealed, with brutal clarity, how far the struggle over Kansas had gone. The failure of the Lecompton path did not make Kansas safe. It removed one pro-slavery route to statehood, but it did not remove the anger, fear, or local power struggles that had grown along the border. In the spring of 1858, The territory was still living with the habits of the previous years: armed association, suspicion, political revenge, and the belief that control of a neighborhood might decide control of a future state. That is the setting for one of the starkest episodes in the history of Bleeding Kansas, the Marais de Cygnes massacre. It happened on May 19, 1858, in Lynn County, Kansas Territory. The place was not a convention hall, a legislative chamber, or a town square. It was a ravine near the Marais de Cygnes, a name carried from French into the geography of eastern Kansas. Today, that ravine is preserved as a Kansas Historical Society state historic site. Its preservation matters because the site fixes the memory of territorial violence in a specific landscape. Bleeding Kansas can sometimes sound like a broad label, a political phrase, or a prelude to something larger. At Marais de Cygnes, it becomes a narrow place in the ground. The known outline is direct and grim. Pro-slavery men shot 11 Free State men in Lynn County. 5 were killed. 5 were wounded. 1 escaped injury by pretending to be dead. The numbers are simple, but they resist being passed over. 11 men were taken into violence at once. Of those, nearly half died. Nearly all the rest were wounded. The only one not physically struck survived because he appeared to be among the dead. That detail gives the event its particular terror. Survival depended not on law, negotiation, or the protection of a settled government, but on stillness, deception, and the hope that armed men would leave the ravine without looking too closely. By 1858, Kansas had already seen fraudulent elections, rival governments, newspaper destruction, the sack of Lawrence, killings near Pottawatomie Creek, cross-border raids, and retaliatory violence. The territory had already taught its residents that politics could arrive at the door with weapons, but Marais de Cygnes stands out because of its concentrated form. It was not an election overturned by fraudulent ballots. It was not a symbolic attack on a free state town. It was not the destruction of presses or the burning of a building identified with a cause. It was the shooting of men identified with the free state side, carried out by pro-slavery men in a ravine. The setting helps explain why the massacre became so powerful in memory. A ravine is not neutral ground in the imagination. It suggests removal from public view, a place below the level of ordinary movement, a place where victims could be gathered and violence could be completed, away from the formal spaces of politics. In the history of Kansas Territory, that matters. So much of the conflict had been argued in the language of law: popular sovereignty, territorial elections, legislative authority, state constitutions, congressional admission. Yet again and again, law had failed to settle the question on the ground. At Marais de Cygnes, the distance between political theory and lived reality became painfully clear. The doctrine that had opened Kansas to this struggle was supposed to allow settlers to decide the status of slavery through territorial politics. But by this point, the process had been deeply damaged. Voting had been shadowed by cross-border intervention. The first territorial legislative election had helped install a pro-slavery legislature through fraudulent ballots cast by heavily armed Missourians. Anti-slavery forces had answered with their own institutions. Pro-slavery and free state communities had come to see one another, not merely as opponents, but as threats. The conflict had produced names that hardened identity: border ruffians for Missourians who crossed into Kansas to influence elections and intimidate free state settlers, and Jayhawkers for Kansans, later associated with raiding forces. Those names were more than insults. They marked a world in which men could be sorted by allegiance before any court had heard a charge, before any neutral process had weighed a claim. Marais de Cygnes belongs to that world. The victims were free state men. The attackers were pro-slavery men. The violence was political, not because it occurred in a legislature, but because the categories of the territorial conflict defined who was vulnerable and why. Lynn County lay within the larger borderland where eastern Kansas and western Missouri formed the main conflict zone. The Missouri line had made movement easy from the beginning of the crisis. Men could cross to vote, raid, intimidate, or retreat. Communities did not experience the border as an abstract boundary. They experienced it as a route, a risk, and sometimes a warning. By 1858, that geography had already shaped the emotional life of the territory. Settlers knew that political events far away could produce local consequences. The failure of Lecompton and Washington did not end the contest over power in Kansas. It could instead heighten the sense that victory had to be won or defended by other means. The massacre at Marais des Cygnes also shows how the Kansas conflict could narrow from public movements into personal vulnerability. Earlier chapters followed institutions, the New England Emigrant Aid Company, the Proslavery Territorial Legislature, the Free State government centered in Lawrence and Topeka, the Convention at Lecompton, the United States Congress. Those institutions mattered. They carried money, migration, authority, and national attention into the territory. But the border war was also fought in smaller units: roads, cabins, creeks, hotels, ravines. The argument over slavery's future did not remain in documents. It entered the countryside. The Ravine in Lynn County has endured as a historic site because it condenses the violence of the period into a scene that can still be located. Preservation by the Kansas Historical Society does not undo the killings, but it refuses to let them dissolve into general language. It says that the event took place here, in a specific terrain, on a specific day, with a specific toll: 11 Free State men shot, 5 killed, 5 wounded, 1 escaping injury by pretending to be dead. That specificity is important because Bleeding Kansas has often been described through broad estimates and contested totals. Historians have disagreed over the number of people killed in political violence in territorial Kansas. The Kansas Historical Society estimates at least 60 deaths and possibly as many as 200. Within that uncertain larger accounting, Marais des Cygnes is one of the clearest and most severe single episodes. It demonstrates that by 1858, even as the constitutional fight moved toward its final form, violence remained embedded in the territory's political life. The massacre did not decide Kansas statehood by itself. It did not produce a constitution, admit Kansas to the Union, or formally end the struggle between slave state and free state visions. But it revealed the cost of delay and the danger of unresolved authority. For years, Kansas had been asked to settle slavery through popular sovereignty, while its elections, settlements, newspapers, conventions, and border communities became targets of force. Each failure of legitimacy left room for retaliation. Each armed episode made the next one easier to imagine. Marais des Cygnes came after the great national controversy over Lecompton had exposed the weakness of the pro-slavery statehood strategy. But the massacre showed that political defeat in one arena did not automatically produce peace in another. If anything, the border war had developed its own momentum. The local struggle could continue after a document failed. It could continue after Congress resisted admission under a pro-slavery constitution. It could continue because people on the ground still lived among enemies, rumors, and memories of earlier attacks. In that sense, the Ravine was not a departure from the story of Kansas statehood. It was part of the same story. The constitutions and the killings belonged to the same crisis. One asked who had the legal right to speak for Kansas. The other showed what happened when people no longer trusted legal speech to protect them. By the end of 1858, Kansas was still not a state. The Lecompton Constitution had failed to carry it into the Union as a slave state. The Free State cause had not yet reached its final legal victory. But the moral and political meaning of the territory was becoming harder to ignore. Kansas had shown that the national conflict over slavery was already violent before formal civil war began. It had shown that a border could become a battlefield without an official declaration. It had shown that a territorial policy presented as democratic choice could collapse when intimidation and armed power entered the vote. The ravine at Marais des Cygnes remained as evidence of that collapse. Its silence was not emptiness. It held the memory of men shot for belonging to one side of a political struggle that the nation had failed to contain. From there, the Kansas story would move again toward constitutions and admission, toward the Wyandotte Constitution and the eventual entry of Kansas into the Union as a free state. But that final path would carry with it the memory of places like Lynn County, where the price of the decision had already been paid in blood. From the ravine at Marais des Cygnes, the Kansas story moved once more into the language of constitutions. That movement can look from a distance like a return to order. After years of contested elections, rival governments, raids, newspaper destruction, and killings, the formal route to statehood passed again through convention, ratification, congressional action, and admission to the Union. But the paper record did not erase the violence behind it. It carried that violence forward, quietly, as part of the meaning of Kansas statehood. By the late 1850s, Kansas Territory had already produced more than one vision of its future. The Topeka, Lecompton, Leavenworth, and Wyandotte constitutions were not just alternate legal drafts. They were evidence of a territory in which legitimacy itself had fractured. Each constitution belonged to a larger struggle over who could speak for Kansas, who counted as the people, and whether the result would protect slavery or prohibit it. The Lecompton Constitution had represented the most direct pro-slavery attempt to carry Kansas into the Union as a slave state. Drafted in Lecompton in 1857 and sent into the national arena by President James Buchanan, it had reached Congress with the weight of presidential recommendation behind it. On February 2, 1858, Buchanan submitted that constitution and recommended Kansas admission as a slave state. But Kansas was not admitted under Lecompton. That failure mattered because it showed that even at the highest levels of government, the old forms of territorial process could no longer command automatic trust. What followed was not immediate peace. The massacre at Marais de Cygnes in May 1858 showed that the defeat of one political program did not remove the habits of fear and revenge that had settled into the border country. Still, the pro-slavery path had narrowed. The effort to make Kansas a slave state through Lecompton had failed, and the Free State cause, which had survived years of intimidation and internal crisis, now moved toward the document that would become decisive. That document was the Wyandotte Constitution. Ratified in 1859, the Wyandotte Constitution became the basis for Kansas statehood. In the long sequence of territorial conflict, this fact is easy to state and harder to absorb. The document did not emerge into a neutral landscape. It came after the Kansas-Nebraska Act had made the Missouri Compromise restriction inoperative and substituted popular sovereignty for congressional exclusion of slavery. It came after armed Missourians had crossed into Kansas in March 1855 and helped shape a pro-slavery territorial legislature through fraudulent ballots. It came after Lawrence had been attacked, presses smashed, type thrown into the Kansas River, and the Free State Hotel targeted as a symbol of anti-slavery organization. It came after Pottawatomie Creek, after the caning of Charles Sumner in the Senate, after the names Border Ruffian and Jayhawker had hardened into identities, and after men in Lynn County had been marched into a ravine and shot. The Wyandotte Constitution therefore marked more than a legal preference. It marked the outcome of a territorial struggle that had been fought through migration, voting, intimidation, rival institutions, and force. Kansas had not simply debated slavery. Kansas had been made into a test case for whether a republic could turn a moral and economic crisis over human bondage into a local vote and then accept the result as legitimate. That test had failed long before statehood came. Popular sovereignty had promised that settlers would decide. In practice, the question became who could control the conditions under which settlers arrived, voted, organized, published, defended themselves, or crossed a border with weapons. The Missouri-Kansas line made the doctrine especially unstable. Eastern Kansas and western Missouri were close enough that political action could become cross-border action quickly. Men could enter the territory to influence an election, take part in a raid, or retreat across the line. Free state organizers, pro-slavery settlers, abolitionists, and armed bands all understood that geography was part of power. That is why Kansas statehood, when it finally came, was not only a victory for one constitutional document. It was a judgment on a system that had tried to avoid a national decision by relocating the conflict. The country had asked Kansas to settle what the country itself could not settle. The territory answered, but it answered through years of disorder and bloodshed. On January 29, 1861, Kansas entered the Union as the 34th state. It entered as a free state. The date matters. By then, the national crisis had moved far beyond Kansas alone. The admission of Kansas came in the final winter before the Civil War formally began. The state that had been imagined as a test of popular sovereignty entered the Union after demonstrating that the test had produced violence instead of settlement. Kansas arrived not as a quiet Western addition, but as a warning whose meaning had already been written across towns, roads, polling places, newspaper offices, hotels, creeks, and ravines. The human cost remains difficult to state with precision. The Kansas Historical Society estimates that deaths from political violence in territorial Kansas were at least 60 and possibly as many as 200. Historians disagree on the total. That range is itself part of the story. Bleeding Kansas was not a single battle with one official casualty list. It was a scattered border conflict made of raids, ambushes, killings, retaliations, and local confrontations that did not always leave clear records. Some deaths became famous. Others remained buried in county memory, family grief, or partisan accounts. But uncertainty over the exact number should not soften the reality. At least 60 people died in political violence in territorial Kansas, and perhaps many more. They died before Fort Sumter. They died before the Civil War had its formal opening. They died in a struggle over whether slavery would expand and over whether democratic procedure could survive when one side's freedom depended on another side's enslavement. That is the central meaning of Bleeding Kansas. The conflict did not cause the Civil War by itself. No single territory, law, election, speech, raid, or constitution can carry the full weight of that explanation. But Kansas revealed the condition of the Union with unusual clarity. It showed that the slavery question had moved beyond compromise language. It showed that legal mechanisms could collapse when the underlying moral crisis remained unresolved. It showed that a border could become a battlefield before armies were officially mobilized. It showed that newspapers, hotels, legislatures, settlements, and constitutional conventions could all become instruments in a struggle that was already national. Kansas also exposed the weakness of distance as a political solution. Congress could create a territory. It could declare a doctrine. It could imagine that local voters would decide the issue. But the people who came to Kansas did not arrive as blank citizens entering a neutral experiment. They arrived with institutions behind them, fears around them, and national expectations attached to their actions. Pro-slavery men understood Kansas as a line of defense. Free staters understood it as a place where slavery's expansion could be stopped. Abolitionists saw still deeper moral stakes. Missourians along the border saw danger close to home. Each side believed the future could be changed by who settled, who voted, who armed, and who endured. By the time Kansas became a state, the Free State result was clear. But the victory did not undo the evidence produced along the way. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened the border. Popular sovereignty had placed the slavery question into territorial politics. Cross-border intervention had broken trust. Rival governments had challenged authority. Lawrence had become a symbol and then a target. Pottawatomie had made retaliation part of the Free State story as well. Marais de Cygnes had shown the continued brutality of the struggle even after the Lecompton path failed. The Wyandotte Constitution then supplied the legal foundation for admission, but the road to that foundation had been anything but orderly. On January 29, 1861, the Union gained a new free state. It also received the final territorial verdict from a place that had already lived through a preview of the war to come. The phrase Bleeding Kansas can sound, after so many retellings, almost symbolic. But it was not only a symbol. It was a lived conflict across farms, towns, rivers, roads, and borders. It was politics under armed pressure. It was law tested by fraud. It was settlement turned into strategy. It was speech answered by violence, and violence answered by more violence. Kansas entered the Union as the 34th state, free in law. Yet its history as a territory had already shown how close the nation was to open war. Before the first great campaigns of the Civil War, before the vast casualty lists and military maps, Kansas had demonstrated that Americans were already willing to kill and die over slavery's future. That is why the border war, before the Civil War, belongs inside the larger history of the war itself. Bleeding Kansas was not a prelude in the sense of something separate and harmless that came before. It was the sound of the crisis breaking through early. It was the warning that compromise had failed, not only in Congress, but on the ground. And when Kansas finally entered the Union as a free state, it did so carrying both a constitutional achievement and a record of blood, a record that made clear the war still coming had, in many ways, already begun.